Hey there, brilliant minds, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we don't just scratch the surface. Nope, we really unearth the fascinating, sometimes surprising nuggets hidden inside complex topics. Today, we're plunging headfirst into something truly universal. Something that, let's be honest, probably frustrates you pretty regularly. Forgetting, you know the drill, right? That word is right there on the tip of your tongue, or maybe a name you know, a fact you learned, or you walk into a room and poof, the reason you went in there just vanishes. It's incredibly common and often maddening. But here's the twist, the real kicker. What if I told you that most of the time, those lost memories, they aren't actually gone forever? What if they're not deleted, but simply, well, hiding? Sort of patiently waiting for the right signal, the perfect trigger to call them out from the depths of your mind. Our mission today is to fundamentally reshape how you think about memory, and maybe more importantly, how you think about forgetting. We're diving deep, really deep, into a concept known as cue-dependent forgetting. And we've assembled a truly rich stack of sources for this exploration. We've got several and frankly, profoundly personal landscape of your own mind.
Indeed, and it's a concept that doesn't just challenge our everyday sort of intuitive understanding of memory. It often completely overturns it. We tend to instinctively assume that forgetting means a memory has deteriorated, maybe faded, or just vanished like a crucial file has been permanently deleted from our brain's hard drive. Gone. Irrevocably lost. But as we're about to explore, the compelling evidence really overwhelmingly suggests that frequently the information is still very much available. It's sitting there within our vast memory store. It's simply inaccessible because we haven't encountered or, generated the right retrieval cue. So this deep dive isn't just about understanding what cue-dependent forgetting is. It's really about grasping why this distinction matters so immensely for how we learn, how we remember, and critically, how we can even begin to optimize our cognitive environment to retrieve what we need when we need it. Think of it as gaining a powerful new insight into the very operating system of your own mind.
So settle in, because you're definitely about to experience some genuine aha moments. We're diving deep into the fascinating, intricate world of memory cues and hopefully starting to unlock some of those hidden pathways within your own brain. Let's get started. Okay, let's unpack this absolute core idea first, because it's pretty foundational to everything else we're going to talk about. When we forget something, our first, almost knee-jerk thought is often, oh no, it's gone, right? Like a digital file sent to the recycling bin and then permanently emptied. It feels so final, so absolute, but that's not the full story, is it?
Not at all. And recognizing that nuance is precisely where the critical distinction lies. It's key to truly understanding the mechanisms of forgetting. Early on, pioneering researchers in memory, people like the renowned Tulving and his colleagues, notably Zena Pearlstone in a foundational 1966 study, they began to propose a more sophisticated model. They suggested that for the successful retrieval of any encoded event, any memory, two fundamental conditions must be met. First, the information itself has to actually be available in memory storage. This just means it was successfully recorded, it exists somewhere within the neural architecture of our brain, it got in there. Second, and this is where our deep dive truly begins, we must be able to access that information at the specific time we need it. It's like the difference between having a book somewhere in a huge library versus knowing exactly which shelf and which spot to find it on.
Okay, so availability versus accessibility, that's the absolute key distinction then. It's not just about whether the memory is in there somewhere, but whether you can actually get to it right here, right now.
Precisely, yeah. This dual requirement for remembering laid the essential groundwork. It helped distinguish between different types of forgetting that had previously been sort of lumped together. Tulving and Madigan, in their really impactful 1970 work, they formally labeled these two primary sources of retrieval failure. They gave us the terminology we still use today. So the first one is trace-dependent forgetting. This happens when the stored event information itself, the memory trace, has deteriorated, maybe decayed, or been irretrievably lost from the memory store. In this scenario, the memory is truly unavailable. You can think of it like a very old, faded photograph where the image just isn't discernible anymore, or maybe a corrupted digital file that simply won't open no matter what software you try. The information has genuinely degraded or vanished from your brain's long-term storage. It's gone. The second type, and the main focus of our discussion today, is cue-dependent forgetting. This is when the information is still very much present, still available, sitting intact within your memory system. However, we simply cannot access it because the necessary retrieval cues those prompts or triggers that point us to the memory they're either absent or just not strong enough at the moment of recall. The memory trace itself is perfectly intact, securely stored away, but we just don't have the right key or the correct, let's say, search term to unlock it and bring it to conscious awareness. It's not gone, it's merely out of reach for the moment.
Okay, so if a memory is trace-dependent forgotten, it's really gone, like permanent loss, like a genuinely erased whiteboard. But if it's cue-dependent forgotten, it's just temporarily out of reach, maybe hidden behind other stuff, just waiting for the right trigger. That immediately gives me hope for all those forgotten facts, names, and even entire conversations that I'm convinced are still lurking somewhere in my mental archives.
Exactly. That's the critical and honestly often quite optimistic insight of cue-dependent forgetting. It fundamentally redefines forgetting. It doesn't necessarily imply a permanent loss, which is a really powerful shift in perspective. As the French philosopher Henri Bergson so eloquently put it, we trail behind us, unawares, the whole of our past, but our memory pours into the present only the odd recollection or two that in some way complete our present situation. That quote beautifully encapsulates the inherent selectivity of retrieval. It emphasizes the powerful and often subtle role of context and specific cues in bringing memories forward. It suggests our mind isn't actively deleting past experiences. Instead, it's selectively presenting what's relevant or accessible based on our immediate environment and current mental state.
Okay, before we dive into the really fascinating evidence for this idea, let's connect it to what many listeners might already be familiar with. What about some of the other common theories of forgetting that we've all probably heard about? How do these traditional views fit in? Or maybe more importantly, how do they differ from this concept of cue-dependent forgetting? Because they often sound a bit more final about memory loss.
Yeah, it's crucial to differentiate cue-dependent forgetting from these other well-established theories. They often assume a more permanent alteration or outright loss of the memory itself, or focus on specific limitations of memory systems. Saul MacLeod, a prominent psychology writer, summarizes several traditional theories that tend to lean more towards trace-dependent ideas or focus on the structural limitations. So first, we have trace decay theory. This one primarily applies to short-term memory, STM, very early stages of memory. It suggests that memory traces those hypothetical physical or chemical changes in the brain, representing a memory they just physically or chemically fade over a very short period, usually 15 to 30 seconds if they aren't actively maintained through rehearsal. Think of it like writing a message in disappearing ink. If you don't keep rewriting it or tracing over it, it just fades away, gone. The information is genuinely lost.
Okay, so just fading away. Then what about displacement? I've heard of that one too. Is that different?
It is. Displacement theory, also primarily for STM, argues that because short-term memory has a pretty limited capacity, famously put at about 7 plus or minus 2 items by George Miller, new information can literally push out or displace older information.
So it's not just fading, but actively being shoved aside, almost like a mental game of musical chairs in our short-term memory, where the music stops and only a few get a seat.
Precisely. Yeah, think of it like a very active conveyor belt. As new items are added at one end, the oldest items literally fall off the other. They're no longer available. This theory can elegantly explain things like the recency effect in free recall, where items presented later in a list are remembered well because they haven't yet been displaced. Then, moving to long-term memory, LTM, we encounter interference theory. This suggests that forgetting occurs when other memories disrupt one another. They essentially make it harder to distinguish between similar pieces of information. And this disruption can happen in two main ways. First, proactive interference. This is when old, previously learned memories interfere with or make it harder to learn and accurately recall new information. So, for example, trying to learn a new programming language might be harder if you've been deeply immersed in a similar but structurally different one for years. Your old habits kind of get in the way. Second, retroactive interference. Here, new learning disrupts the recall of old memories. If you learn French vocabulary really well and then later learn Spanish vocabulary, the recently acquired Spanish might make it harder to recall the French you knew perfectly well just a short while ago. The new knowledge actively impacts the older stuff. And finally, there's the concept of lack of consolidation. This is a more biologically oriented theory. It suggests that memory traces don't fully solidify. They don't fully transfer from a temporary, fragile state into stable, long-term memory. This process is often critically linked to the hippocampus and other brain structures in the medial temporal lobe. They act as a kind of temporary holding and processing area for new memories. The famous case of HMM, the patient who had parts of his brain, including the hippocampus, surgically removed for epilepsy, that dramatically demonstrated this. HM developed severe anterograde amnesia. He couldn't form any new long-term memories and also had some retrograde amnesia for about 2 years before his surgery. This pointed to the idea that memory consolidation is gradual. It can actually take years to complete. And if it's interrupted, memories might never become truly permanent.
Okay, so many of these traditional theories often assume the memory itself is either altered, degraded, or outright gone genuinely unavailable. But cue-dependent forgetting offers a fundamentally different, and like you said, often more optimistic perspective, that the memory is intact, just temporarily out of reach. That's a fundamentally different way to approach why we forget, and it really opens up new avenues for trying to remember. All right, so if these keys, these retrieval cues, are so incredibly important, not just for learning new things, but even for recalling stuff we thought was forgotten, how did researchers first start to really demonstrate this power in a controlled scientific way? What were those early experiments like that truly opened this door and challenged the old assumptions about memory loss?
Yeah, Tulving's work, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, was absolutely instrumental here. He meticulously designed experiments that cleverly isolated the role of retrieval cues. Crucially, he held the initial memory trace constant while systematically varying the cues available for retrieval. This allowed him to directly observe and quantify the huge impact of cues on successful recall. One of his key early studies, done with Michael Watkins and cited around 1974, was cleverly titled New Cues for Forgotten Words. The methodology was elegant, really, in its simplicity, but profound in its implications. Subjects learned pairs of closely related words, things like bark dog or worse nurse. Their job was to explicitly remember the right-hand word in each pair, so dog or nurse. Then they did 2 different recall tests. The first test used the original left-hand words as cues, so they'd get bark and have to recall dog. Critically, for the second test, subjects got new cues, words that had not appeared in the original study list but were related semantically or maybe phonetically to the target words. So if they failed to recall dog in the first test, they might then get grog, which rhymes with dog, as a new cue. Or for nurse, maybe they'd get doctor as a prompt. And this second test was specifically done only for words they had failed to recall in the first try.
Okay, so targeting the ones they specifically forgot with the original cue.
Exactly. And the findings were quite powerful, pretty unequivocal. Even for words that subjects had clearly forgotten in the first test, meaning they were inaccessible with the original cue, a significant portion, somewhere between 22% and 30%, were successfully recalled with these new, different cues. The implication here was massive. If those words were truly lost or their memory traces had degraded after the first recall failure, then giving them new, seemingly unrelated cues shouldn't have helped at all. The fact that these new cues did trigger recall clearly showed that the memory traces were still intact, still available. They were just inaccessible initially because the original cue wasn't sufficient or maybe wasn't the most effective key to unlock them.
Wow, so the memory was there, perfectly preserved, just waiting for a different kind of knock on the door, a different path to be lit up. It's an incredibly strong demonstration right off the bat. It proves that forgetting isn't always gone.
Absolutely. Another compelling experiment from Tulving and Watkins, also cited around 74, was the word fragment experiment. In this study, subjects first learned lists of 28 5-letter words. Then their recall was tested by providing varying amounts of initial letters as cues for each word. So for a target word like grape, different groups might get increasingly informative cues like gen or gra or grap or even grape with missing letters, Some control groups got no explicit cues at all, just did a standard free recall task. The findings showed a really consistent pattern, a direct increase in recall probability as more initial letters, meaning more relevant retrieval information, were provided in the cue. Since the original learning was identical for all groups, the memory traces were assumed to be the same strength initially. So the variation in recall only because of the cues directly highlighted the profound relationship between the amount of appropriate retrieval information and successful recall. It even implied that in free recall, where there are no external cues, some implicit self-generated cues must be operating to allow any recall at all.
That makes perfect sense. The more hints you get, the easier it is to find the exact memory you're looking for. It's like having more letters filled in on a crossword puzzle. But it can't just be the quantity of the cue, right? The type or quality of the cue must matter too, because some hints are definitely better than others.
Precisely. Yeah, that's a crucial point. A third influential experiment, by Light in 1972 demonstrated this nuanced point very well. In this study, subjects learned target words presented either alone or embedded within meaningful sentences. They then tried to recall these words either with no cues or with specific types of cues like homonyms, words that sound alike but mean different things, synonyms, words with similar meanings, or even the identical target word itself. The findings clearly revealed that different types of retrieval cues showed vastly different levels of effectiveness, sometimes called their valence or power. For instance, the identical word cue was almost always super effective. A synonym might be less so, and a phonetically similar homonym even less reliable. The implication was clear: not all cues are created equal. The type and quality of the retrieval information are absolutely crucial, not just its mere presence. A cue that strongly aligns with how the memory was originally encoded, a principle later called encoding specificity, will be far more effective than a less relevant or less specific one.
Okay, so these early studies really laid the fundamental groundwork. They moved us beyond that simple on-off switch model of memory, where information is either perfectly there or completely gone. It revealed this nuanced system where access is critically determined by the key you use. But does this intricate dance of cues and memory hold up in more complex real-world scenarios? Especially when considered differences we see across the lifespan, like, the widely discussed phenomenon of aging and memory decline.
Absolutely. The principles found in these early studies have profound and direct real-world relevance, particularly when we consider complex cognitive phenomena like age-related memory changes. Let's look at a truly groundbreaking study that directly applied these cue-dependent principles to adult aging and memory, and it offered a much more optimistic outlook than was previously assumed.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, personally relevant for many of us, especially as we or our loved ones get older. We hear so much about age-related memory decline, and it's a common concern. It's often framed as this kind of irreversible loss. But is that also maybe a case of cue-dependent forgetting? Or is something else entirely going on there, something more intrinsically detrimental?
That's exactly the crucial question David F. Hultsch investigated in his significant 1975 study, Adult Age Differences in Retrieval. His research was designed specifically to clarify whether the observed age-related memory differences were primarily due to trace-dependent forgetting, meaning a genuine loss or degradation of the elementary memory units themselves, impacting their availability, or if it was more about cue-dependent forgetting, meaning a difficulty in accessing higher-order memory units despite their availability. Or maybe even a combination of both. This was a really crucial distinction to make, both theoretically and practically.
So how did Hultsch set up his experiment to try and tease apart these two types of forgetting? How could he distinguish what was truly lost versus what was just inaccessible, especially across different age groups? What was his methodology?
He used a carefully designed, multi-trial free recall task. This allowed him to differentiate between the availability and accessibility of different levels of information. He involved 3 distinct age groups to get a comprehensive view of adult development: young adults aged 18 to 34, middle-aged adults 50 to 64, and older adults 65 to 83. And importantly, both men and women participated across these groups, ensuring broad representation. For the stimulus material, participants learned lists of 40 words. These words were strategically chosen and broken into 10 highly familiar conceptual categories, like types of fruit or animals, with 4 specific words per category. For example, apple, banana, orange, grape for fruit. Critically, all words from a given category were presented together in a block during the initial study phase. This grouping was deliberate. It encourages subjects to organize the information into these higher-order conceptual units, the categories themselves. This makes the categories a potential target for recall, not just the individual words. Next, Hultsch cleverly manipulated the recall conditions to isolate the role of cues. Half the subjects were called under a cued recall condition. Here, the category names, like fruit, animals, were explicitly provided on the recall sheet as prompts or keys. The other half were called under a non-cued recall condition, which was basically a free recall task. Participants had no explicit category prompts. They just had to remember as many words as possible from the list. Hultsch then measured 3 key aspects of their performance to precisely distinguish between the types of forgetting. 1. Total words recalled. This was just a general overall measure of memory performance. 2. A number of categories recalled. This was considered his primary index of cue-dependent forgetting. It reflects the accessibility of those higher-order conceptual units. A category was counted as recalled if the participant remembered at least 1 word from it, indicating they'd successfully accessed that broader conceptual group. And 3, number of words recalled per category. This was considered a direct index of trace-dependent forgetting. It measured the availability of the elementary units, the individual words given that the higher order category unit had already been accessed, either spontaneously or with the help of a cue.
Wow, okay. That's a really sophisticated and precise way to differentiate these two sources of forgetting within a single experiment. It sounds like he truly managed to isolate the mechanisms at play. So, what were the illuminating and maybe surprising findings from this pivotal study? What did he actually find?
The results were indeed highly illuminating. They provided compelling evidence for this intricate interplay of both types of forgetting in the context of aging. First, regarding overall words recalled, significant age differences were clear, which lined up perfectly with prior research. Younger adults consistently recalled significantly more words than both middle-aged and older adults. Also, as we'd expect from our earlier discussion, cued recall was significantly better than non-cued recall across all age groups. Interestingly, the young adult cued group recalled significantly more words than all other groups, highlighting the benefit of cues, particularly for younger folks who might be more efficient at using them. Now, here's where it gets particularly interesting and impactful. Focusing on categories recalled, which was Hultsch's index for cue-dependent forgetting, the accessibility of higher order units. In the non-cued condition, free recall, both the middle-aged and older groups recalled significantly fewer categories than the younger group. This strongly suggested an age-related difficulty in spontaneously accessing those broader conceptual units without any external help. This is the common, often frustrating experience older adults might report, right?
Right, that makes sense. That's kind of the stereotype.
Exactly.
Ah.
However, the critical and perhaps most optimistic finding was in the cued recall condition. When category names were explicitly provided as retrieval cues, there were no significant differences among the three age groups in the number of categories recalled.
Well, wait, no difference at all.
Pretty much none that were statistically significant. This is a powerful, almost stunning demonstration. It indicates that a substantial, maybe even a very large portion of age-related memory decline, particularly concerning the ability to access broader conceptual structures and organizational frameworks in memory, is profoundly cue-dependent. Provide the right external cues, and much of that observed age difference in the accessibility of conceptual knowledge effectively disappears. The knowledge isn't gone. The older adults just need a clearer prompt to access it. Finally, for words per category, Hultsch's measure for trace-dependent forgetting the availability of elementary units given category access had occurred significant age differences did persist. Younger adults consistently recalled more words per category than middle-aged adults, who in turn recalled more than older adults. This suggests that even when a category was successfully accessed, either spontaneously or with a cue, older adults still struggled more to recall the specific individual words within that category. This points to some genuine unavailability, or perhaps a slower, less efficient search process for those elementary memory units within an activated category. It indicates a degree of trace-dependent forgetting that cues couldn't completely overcome.
Wow, okay, so what does this all mean for us, especially those of us who might be concerned about age-related memory changes in ourselves or, our family members? It sounds like it's not all doom and gloom. There's actually a lot of leverage we might have. This isn't just about my grocery list. This is a profound shift in how we might view cognitive decline and maybe even reshape interventions for older adults. Are we perhaps underestimating the available knowledge in older populations because we're just not providing the right contextual prompts?
That's a truly crucial takeaway, and your interpretation hits the nail right on the head. Hultsch concluded that adult age differences in retrieval are a function of both cue-dependent and trace-dependent forgetting. He did note that the age effect accounted for more of the variance in the words per category measure, about 17%, than in the category recall measure, around 4%. However, a different and equally valid interpretation, especially when considering practical applications, is to look at the magnitude of improvement with cues. The provision of cues for categories was immensely effective. It essentially erased age differences in the accessibility of those higher-order conceptual units. This dramatically underscores the profound potential to mitigate many age-related memory challenges simply by understanding and providing effective retrieval support. It means that while some intrinsic changes in elementary unit availability might occur with age, a very significant part of what we perceive as forgetting in older age is truly about access, not permanent loss.
That is a huge aha moment right there. Seriously. It means that many of our daily struggles with memory, especially as we age, might be solvable, or at least significantly improved, with better, more deliberate cueing strategies. This fundamentally changes how we might approach personal memory difficulties. and even how we design learning environments or communication strategies for older adults. It encourages a proactive approach, rather than just resigned acceptance. You mentioned earlier that a real hallmark of cue-dependent forgetting is its inherent reversibility, this truly profound idea that a memory we thought was gone can actually be brought back. Can you walk us through some other experiments that showcase this unforgetting? Because that concept that forgetting isn't necessarily permanent is what truly separates this theory from others that imply permanent loss.
It truly is profound, yeah. And Tulving's ingenious work provided several compelling demonstrations that directly challenged long-held assumptions about memory loss and permanence. Let's start with inter-trial forgetting and single-trial free recall. This is a phenomenon discussed by Tulving back in 1974. The traditional view, often supported by early dual-store models of memory, like Atkinson and Shiffrin's famous model, suggested something like this. If you present a lump of words, subjects could recall each word immediately after seeing it. Let's call that T1, test 1. But after the whole list is shown, they forget some words, T2, test 2. These dual-store models, which involve a limited capacity short-term memory, STM, and a more permanent long-term memory, LTM, attributed this intra-trial forgetting to the idea that information was displaced from the limited STM before it could be fully transferred into LTM. This implied a genuine trace-dependent loss from STM. It just fell out. However, Tulving offered a radically different cue-dependent reinterpretation. He argued that a memory trace for each word is actually created very rapidly upon perception and immediately enters some form of long-term storage. The forgetting observed at T2 isn't due to trace loss from STM, but rather a change in the retrieval environment caused by the other words presented later in the list. These new words create a kind of noise or change in context that makes some of the earlier traces temporarily inaccessible. The critical part came with the reversibility demonstrated in a subsequent test 3, T3. When specific retrieval cues were later presented, recall increased significantly over what was observed at T2. This showed unequivocally that the forgotten words were still available in memory. The implication here is massive. It challenges the idea that forgetting in free recall means the information never made it to long-term storage. Instead, it suggests it was always there, just needed the right cue to be found and accessed.
Okay, so those dual-store models were maybe missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, the retrieval environment itself actively impacting what could be accessed. That leads us to another classic, retroactive interference. That traditionally sounds like memories are actively destroying or maybe unlearning each other. That really implies permanent loss, doesn't it?
Exactly, and cue-dependent forgetting offered a radically different perspective on that, too. Through the unmasking effect in retroactive interference, a really powerful study by Tulving and Serpka in 1971. So, retroactive interference is that classic forgetting phenomenon where new learning impairs the recall of old learning. For example, learn list A, then learn list B, and suddenly list B makes it harder to recall list A. Traditional interference theories often proposed mechanisms like unlearning or response suppression, suggesting the older memories were either actively erased or pushed down by the new learning. Again, this implied a degradation or permanent alteration of the memory trace itself. Tulving and Sotka designed an experiment specifically to test this. Subjects learned multiple lists, each containing 24 words from 6 distinct conceptual categories, like hut, cottage, tent, hotel, as types of building. The words within categories were grouped during study to encourage semantic organization. Different groups learned varying numbers of lists, from just 1 up to 6. After learning their final list, they took a non-cued recall test, T1, on that very last list. Then, in T2, they were asked to recall all the words from all the lists they had learned, still without specific cues. This T2 test clearly showed the classical retroactive interference. The more lists learned, the more words were forgotten or became inaccessible from earlier lists. But here's the unmasking, the truly revelatory part. After a brief delay in T3, subjects were given a cued recall test. This time they were provided with the category names for all the words they had studied across all lists. The findings were striking. The category names, acting as powerful semantic cues, largely restored recall to its earlier levels, effectively reversing much of the forgetting observed in T2.
Wow, yeah. This was a major blow to unlearning theories. If memories were truly unlearned, overwritten, or degraded, providing cues shouldn't have been able to bring them back like that. The experiment showed pretty unequivocally that interference often makes memories inaccessible, not destroyed. Providing the right informational content in the retrieval environment simply overcomes the noise and competition of interference.
That's absolutely fascinating. So the memories were just buried under a pile of new information, and the cues acted like a mental flashlight or maybe a shovel to dig them out again. The memories were there all along.
Okay, but here's one that truly scrambles what many of us intuitively believe about memory. The idea that recall can sometimes be better than recognition. That sounds completely counterintuitive, almost impossible. I always thought if I could just see something again, I'd definitely recognize it. How can recall be better?
It absolutely is counterintuitive, and it's a truly mind-bending result for traditional memory theories that had always placed recognition as somehow easier or more fundamental than recall. This was famously demonstrated in a study by Tulving and Pearlstone in 1973, which explored the counterintuitive truth when recall is better than recognition. Many theorists, and indeed most people, assume recognition is easier than recall. In recognition, the item is presented directly, right? You just decide if you've seen it before. Recall, by contrast, requires you to generate the item from scratch. So, traditional thinking held that if you failed to recognize an item, its memory trace must surely be gone, making subsequent recall utterly impossible. Tulving and Pearlstone, with their encoding specificity principle really guiding them, fundamentally challenged this assumption. Their methodology was intricate, designed to directly pit recognition against cued recall. First, the study phase. Subjects learned 24 pairs of words, structured as weak associate input cues followed by strong associate target words, things like pretty bluey, glue chair, grasp, baby. Their explicit task was to remember only the second word in each pair. Second, free association. They were then given a list of related words that were not from the original study list, but were strong semantic associates of the target words, for example. Sky, related to blue. Table, related to chair. Infant, related to baby. They were asked to generate free associations to these new words. Interestingly, many of these self-generated associations were, just by chance, the target words from the original study list, like responding blue to sky or chair to table. Third, the recognition test. Next, subjects had to critically recognize which of their self-generated words were actually the original target words from the study list they had learned earlier. They recognized a surprisingly low 24% of them. This was the recognition failure. And fourth, the cued recall test. Finally, subjects were given the original input cues from the study phase, like pretty, glue, grasp, and asked to recall the corresponding target words. In this condition, they recalled a much higher 63%.
63%, after only recognizing 24%.
Exactly. The astonishing paradigm-shifting finding was this. Subjects could successfully recall many list words, 63%, that they had explicitly failed to recognize, 24%. Just moments before.
Okay, now that is really interesting, genuinely mind-bending. So it's not just about having a cue, but having the right cue.
Yeah.
The one that best connects with how the memory was originally formed, how it was initially encoded. This completely flips the script on how I thought about recognition always being superior to recall. It suggests that recognition can actually be a pretty poor measure of a memory's true availability if the recognition cue itself isn't aligned with the original encoding conditions. So basically, our gut feeling that recognizing something is easier might be misleading us about the very nature of memory itself.
Precisely, yeah. This result unequivocally suggests that recognition failure does not necessarily mean the memory trace is gone or unavailable. Instead, the self-generated words, while literally copies of the target items, were often poor retrieval cues because they didn't sufficiently overlap with how the information was encoded alongside its original weak associate partner. The sky cue for blue might generate blue as an association, but it wasn't the specific encoding context of pretty bluey. In contrast, the original input cues, pretty, glue, grasp, were powerful because they matched the initial encoding context much more directly. They adhered to what Tulving termed the encoding specificity principle. This experiment beautifully illustrates that memory access is profoundly specific to the retrieval cues and the encoding context, and not simply about the presence of the item itself or its superficial identity. It's all about the match, the lock, and the key. Right, so these powerful findings demonstrating the huge impact of cues and the reversibility of forgetting, they naturally lead us to explore the different categories of cues that can influence retrieval. As Wikipedia points out, cues can broadly be categorized into semantic, state-dependent, and context-dependent. Understanding these distinctions helps us appreciate the varied ways we can unlock our memories, and conversely, why we sometimes struggle to retrieve them.
Okay, so how do these different types of cues work in practice? Can you give us a clearer, maybe more illustrative picture of each, perhaps with some everyday examples? What do they actually look like?
Certainly. Let's break them down as they each offer a unique pathway into our memory stores. First, we have semantic cues. These are cues related to the meaning, the category, or the conceptual relationships of the information you're trying to recall. They work by activating a network of associated ideas in your mind. A classic example comes from that Tulving and Pearlstone 1966 experiment we mentioned earlier. It showed that people remembered a group of words much better if those words belonged to the same theme category. For instance, if you learn apple, banana, orange explicitly under the mental label fruit, then simply being given the word fruit acts as a potent semantic cue, triggering recall of those specific items. Even emphasizing the sound of a word during encoding can make phonetic cues more effective later on, showing that semantic connections can be quite broad. In a real-world scenario, imagine you're trying to remember if you bought carrots at the grocery store. Your mind might then wander to types of vegetables, and suddenly, carrots, along with maybe broccoli and spinach, might pop into your head because you've successfully accessed the relevant semantic category. Or you might try to remember a book by thinking of other books by the same author or within the same genre. That's semantic cueing.
Okay, so using meaning in categories. What about state-dependent? That sounds more internal.
Exactly. State-dependent cues are internal cues. They're intrinsically related to your emotional or physiological state at the time you initially encoded the information, and then later at the time of retrieval. Your mood, your level of alertness, your internal body chemistry, even the influence of substances like caffeine or alcohol can act as powerful state-dependent cues. The core idea is that memories formed in a particular internal state are more easily retrieved when you are in that same internal state again. A well-known and often amusing example is the Goodwin et al. Study from 1969, which investigated alcohol and recall. They found that when people encoded information while inebriated, they were significantly more likely to recall it when they were in the same state again. A classic anecdote often cited is someone hiding money or valuables while drunk, only to be utterly unable to find them when sober. However, if they become drunk again, the memory of the hiding place might mysteriously resurface. But this isn't just about alcohol, of course. In your daily life, this could mean that trying to remember the specific details of a really heated argument might actually be easier if you're feeling angry or upset again, compared to trying to recall them when you're completely calm and rational. Or, that elusive joke you heard at a party last Saturday night might suddenly resurface the next time you're in a similar state, maybe relaxed with a few drinks, because that internal physiological and emotional state acts as a powerful retrieval cue, bringing with it a whole network of associated memories. It's why sometimes old memories flood back when you're feeling a specific intense emotion, be it joy or sorrow.
Huh. That's wild. Okay, so internal state matters. What about the external world? Context.
That's a third category. Context-dependent cues. These are external cues, meaning they're directly related to the physical environment or broader situation where the memory was originally formed. The physical surroundings, the specific room, the ambient noise, the weather, the general atmosphere, all these can serve as potent triggers for recall. These are the sensory details of a memory setting. A classic and iconic study demonstrating this was by Godin and Baddeley in 1975, famously involving deep-sea divers. Their methodology was pretty ingenious. Two groups of professional divers learned a list of 36 unrelated words. One group learned these words 15 feet underwater, the other learned them on land, right next to the water. Both groups then attempted to recall the words both underwater and on land, creating 4 distinct retrieval conditions. The findings were remarkably clear. Those who learned on land recalled about 38% of the words when subsequently tested on land, but only 21% when tested underwater. Conversely, those who learned underwater recalled 32% when tested underwater, but only 21% when tested back on land.
So a big difference depending on where they recalled versus where they learned.
A huge difference. It dramatically showed that recall was significantly better when the learning and recall environments matched. The physical context itself acted as a powerful retrieval cue. In the real world, this effect is often experienced when, for example, you return to an old home or school you haven't visited in years. You might suddenly be flooded with vivid, long-forgotten memories you didn't even realize you had, simply because the familiar environment provides a rich array of context-dependent cues: the smells, the sights, the sounds. Abernethy back in 1940 even showed that students sometimes perform worse on exams if the examination room's environmental conditions, like temperature, noise, or even specific scents, differ significantly from where they originally studied. It's why studying in the same classroom where you'll take the test can sometimes give you a slight edge.
That's truly fascinating. This raises an important practical question, though. So if I want to remember something for an exam, is the practical implication that I should ideally try to study in an environment that physically resembles the exam hall as closely as possible? Or maybe for presentation, practice in the actual room. Does that really help?
Precisely. Well, ideally, yes. While it's not always practical to perfectly replicate an exam hall or a presentation venue, the underlying principle of context-dependent memory is crystal clear. The greater the overlap between the encoding environment and the retrieval environment, the better your recall is likely to be. Even seemingly small details, like the smell of a particular odor, maybe the background hum of an air conditioner, or certain type of ambient music that was present during encoding, can later act as surprisingly strong context-dependent cues. They prompt memories you might otherwise struggle to access. It's all about maximizing that cue match to the original learning scenario. So yes, if you can, study in a quiet, somewhat sterile room if your exam will be in one. Or if you practice your speech in the actual auditorium, you're definitely leveraging these principles.
Okay, so the evidence for cue-dependent forgetting seems incredibly robust, right? And its ability to explain how memories can be recovered is truly compelling. But memory research is always evolving, always finding new wrinkles. And there are other complex phenomena that challenge existing ideas. One concept that emerged, called retrieval-induced forgetting, or RIF, initially seemed to suggest a different and almost contradictory mechanism entirely: active inhibition. Can you tell us about that and how it seemed to clash with what we've been discussing about memories merely being inaccessible?
Absolutely. Yeah, retrieval-induced forgetting, or RF, as first introduced by Michael Anderson and his colleagues back in 1994, describes a seemingly counterintuitive and initially quite perplexing phenomenon. It's this. Repeatedly recalling a specific item can actually make it harder to recall related but unpracticed items later on. This appeared at first glance to be a different kind of forgetting, perhaps even a form of active memory suppression, which directly clashed with the idea of simple inaccessibility due to missing cues. The standard paradigm for demonstrating ARIF is quite structured, and it's been replicated many times. First, the study phase. Participants first learn multiple category exemplar pairs, like fruit orange and fruit apple, or tool hammer and tool spanner. Crucially, each category typically has several examples associated with it. Second, the retrieval practice phase. Participants then engage in practice where they repeatedly recall some items from some of these categories. This is done using a category plus word stem cue, like fruit or prompting the recall of orange. This practice phase intentionally creates three distinct types of items. There are RP plus items. These are the ones that were repeatedly practiced, like orange. Their memory trace should be strengthened. Then, RP items. These are the items that were not practiced but belong to the same category as the practiced items, like apple from the fruit category. These are the critical competitors that IFRIF affects. And finally, U items. These are completely unpracticed items from unpracticed categories, like hammer from the tool category. These serve as a baseline control. Third is the final test phase. After a delay, participants are asked to recall all studied items from all categories. The initial and highly consistent findings from Anderson et al. Showed that RP items were recalled less often than U items. In other words, the act of retrieving orange actually made it harder to remember apple later on, even though apple was never directly suppressed or interfered with in the same way. This was the core RIF effect.
Okay, so practicing one thing hurts related things.
Right. And the proponents of RIF initially argued that this wasn't just simple interference, where similar memories get mixed up, or merely a strengthening of the practiced item. Instead, they proposed it was due to active inhibition. The brain, they suggested, actively suppresses or inhibits competing related memories, like apple, to allow the target memory orange to be retrieved efficiently and without distraction. If a memory is inhibited in this way, the argument went, it should be fundamentally harder to access regardless of the cue used to try and retrieve it. This led to the cue independence argument, the idea that RAF should be observed even when a completely independent probe or a new, different cue is used to access the forgotten RP item.
So the idea was that the memory itself was suppressed or deactivated, almost globally, not just that the path to it from a specific cue was blocked. That's a really strong claim, isn't it? And it seems to go directly against our earlier discussion of cue-dependent forgetting, where the memory is still available, just inaccessible. It posits a more permanent seeming, or at least universal, form of forgetting that inhibition applies to. That feels different.
It certainly raised important questions about the fundamental nature of forgetting. Was inhibition a new, distinct mechanism operating differently from cue-dependent inaccessibility? This apparent contradiction led to a crucial series of experiments by Perfect, Stark, Tree, Moulin, Ahmed, and Hutter in 2004. Their paper was titled, provocatively, Transfer Appropriate Forgetting, the Cue-Dependent Nature of Retrieval-Induced Forgetting. They directly challenged the cue independence argument for IREF, aiming to show that RIF itself might, in fact, be entirely cue-dependent. Their innovative approach was to use episodically linked, truly independent cues rather than relying solely on semantically related cues, which might still, covertly link back to the original category. Their goal was to find a cue that has no inherent semantic connection to the category or its examples, but was simply associated with the event of learning that specific item. In their first experiment, Experiment 1, using faces as cues, participants studied category exemplar pairs like fruit orange, but crucially, each pair was also presented with a unique photograph of a face. These faces were arbitrarily paired with a verbal material, making them semantically and statistically independent of the words themselves. The subsequent retrieval practice used only the familiar category plus word stem cues, for example, sporty for tennis, with no faces shown during practice. The final test then used either the category cue alone, the face cue alone, or a joint face plus category cue. Their findings were quite clear and impactful. They found robust RIF when the category cue alone was used at test, which directly matched the practice cue. Okay, standard RIF. However, and this is the critical distinction, they found no RIF when the face cue alone was used, or when the joint face plus category cue was used. In fact, the additional face cue actually benefited recall of the RP items that were otherwise forgotten with only the category cue.
So the independent cue bypassed the forgetting.
Exactly. This was a powerful counterargument. If the memory for Apple was truly inhibited globally, any cue should show that deficit. The fact that the independent face cue could recover it meant it wasn't truly inhibited, just inaccessible by the category cue that was involved in the competition. They followed this with Experiment 2, which involved joint cues in practice. Similar to Experiment 1, but this time, the retrieval practice phase also included the face cues alongside the category plus stem cues. Again, RIF was present with the category cues and still NO RIF with the face cues alone. This consistent lack of RIF for independent cues was paramount. Interestingly, though, they found a marginally significant RIF with the joint face plus category cues. This suggested that the context of the practice specifically, what cues were present during the competitive retrieval, influenced where the forgetting manifested itself. It wasn't about the item itself being suppressed, but the cue-item association being affected by the competition. And finally, in Experiment 3, using unrelated words as cues just to further ensure cue independence and control for any potential weirdness with faces, they use unrelated words as purely episodic cues. Participants first learned unrelated word exemplar associations, like zinc apple, and then separately learned category exemplar associations like fruit apple. Retrieval practice again used category plus fragment cues. The final test then used either category cues or the unrelated episodic cues, and the findings again showed RF with the category cues matching practice, but no RF was found with the unrelated episodic cues.
Okay, so what does this whole series of experiments tell us then? Does it mean the inhibition theory was just flat out wrong? Or maybe just that it needed some serious refinement. It truly seems like it swings the pendulum back strongly towards cue-dependent forgetting. Even for these complex competitive effects, the access route seems key.
Yeah, these findings fundamentally challenge the strong inhibitory account of OR, the one that initially posited a general global suppression or deactivation of the memory trace itself. Perfect and colleagues concluded that RF is, in fact, cue-dependent, not cue-independent. They propose the concept of transfer-appropriate forgetting. According to this more nuanced model, forgetting in the context of RF is observed most prominently when the retrieval conditions at the final test most closely match the conditions of the initial retrieval competition that occurred during the practice phase. If the test cues differ significantly from the cues used during the practice phase, the specific context in which the competition originally took place, then the forgetting effect largely disappears. The explanation is subtle but really powerful. Instead of a general universal inhibition of a memory trace for, say, apple, the repeated retrieval practice of orange strengthens the association between the specific practice cue, like fruit plus or, and the target item, orange. It also strengthens the association between that specific cue and the retrieval context of the practice session. Other cues, especially those not directly involved in that particular competitive retrieval event, like the independent face cue, can still effectively access the memory for apple. The difficulty, or forgetting, is therefore localized to the specific retrieval path that was used and strengthened during the competitive practice, not the memory itself being universally suppressed. It's a highly targeted effect on access via a specific route, not on overall availability.
That's a subtle but profoundly powerful distinction. It means the blocking or difficulty isn't a global deactivation of the memory, but is tied to the specific retrieval path that was reinforced or maybe used up during practice. It's like that car parking example they used in their paper, right?
Right.
Remembering where you parked today might make it harder to remember where you parked yesterday if you consistently use the generic parking place cue, because that leads to today's strengthened memory. But if you then think, yesterday I was late because I dropped the kids off at school, so I parked near the east entrance, that specific contextual cue immediately brings back yesterday's parking spot. The memory was never inhibited. The generic cue was just ineffective because it didn't match the specific encoding conditions that would make that memory accessible. The memory was always there, just waiting for the right key. So, after this extensive dive into cue-dependent forgetting and its incredible explanatory power, what are the biggest takeaways here? Why is this still considered such a preferred and robust view, especially within this realm of remembering unique events and specific experiences? Even when faced with newer, seemingly contradictory theories like RIF initially seemed to be.
Well, Tulving, in his seminal 1974 American Scientist article, himself outlined several truly compelling advantages that make cue-dependent forgetting a superior, more parsimonious framework for understanding memory, particularly when compared to purely trace-dependent explanations. First, there's parsimony. A single, unified cue-dependent framework can elegantly explain a wide array of diverse instances of forgetting, from that subtle intra-trial forgetting and free recall to the more pronounced effects of retroactive interference, and even the initially perplexing phenomenon of recognizing less than you can recall. Previously, each of these situations often required separate, complex, and sometimes conflicting trace-dependent explanations. It made the overall theory of memory kind of fragmented and less coherent. Cue dependence simplifies this, offering a more elegant and unified story. Second, its core claim offers a distinct and powerful advantage in verifiability. The hypothesis states that information is still present but merely inaccessible. This isn't just a theoretical assumption, it makes a strong empirical prediction that the forgotten memory can be directly tested and verified by simply restoring the appropriate retrieval cues. The consistent ability to unforget by providing the right cue, as we've seen through numerous experiments, offers direct empirical support that trace-dependent theories, which assume permanent loss, just can't achieve. You can't retrieve what's truly gone right.
Right, you can test it.
Exactly. Third, it brilliantly explains phenomena that deeply challenge other theories, things like reminiscence and spontaneous recovery. Reminiscence is when we sometimes recall things we previously couldn't, even without any new learning or explicit prompting. Spontaneous recovery is when unlearned or seemingly suppressed associations mysteriously reappear after some time. Trace-dependent theories struggle profoundly with these. They'd almost have to imply a lost memory somehow regenerates itself, which is scientifically very difficult to account for. Cue-dependent forgetting, however, simply posits that the retrieval environment can become more appropriate over time, or maybe through an incidental encounter, allowing access to an intact trace that was always there. It makes sense. Fourth, it logically and robustly explains why recall can be superior to recognition. This counterintuitive truth, so powerfully demonstrated by Tulving and Thomson, is really a cornerstone of cue-dependent theory. If remembering is a joint product of the memory trace and the retrieval cue, then it's not about merely seeing the item again, recognition, but fundamentally about the optimal match between the cue and how the information was originally encoded, recall with the right cue. Recognition provides a cue, sure, but if that cue doesn't match the encoding sufficiently, it will fail, even if the memory is perfectly available. And finally, perhaps most importantly for the advancement of science, the hypothesis fosters new, productive research directions. It effectively shifts the focus of memory research away from the often dead-end question, is the memory there, to the far more fertile ground of how do we access it. This encourages intensive investigation into the precise nature of retrieval cues, their effectiveness, their interaction with different types of stored information, and the dynamic processes of retrieval itself. It opens up a rich field of inquiry into the subtle mechanisms of remembering.
That makes so much sense. It really does seem to consolidate disparate findings and challenges into a powerful, elegant, and surprisingly optimistic framework for understanding our minds. But surely even such a broad and powerful view must still face some objections or criticisms. No theory is without its challenges, right?
Indeed, yeah. And Tulving, ever the rigorous scientist, addressed these head-on in his work, which further solidified the robustness of the hypothesis against common criticisms. One criticism often revolved around the implied traces don't change assumption. Critics argued that cue-dependent forgetting implicitly assumes memory traces are immutable, static. Tulving clarified that it merely means we don't need to assume trace changes or deterioration to explain observed forgetting. While traces might change and information could be lost in some instances, he argued there was no compelling evidence that trace loss is solely or even primarily responsible for observed forgetting in many of the cases attributed to it. The theory simply offers a more parsimonious, often verifiable, alternative explanation. It doesn't deny trace change is possible, just that it's not always the primary reason for forgetting. Another criticism was the no permanent forgetting claim. Some critics thought it implied that all memories could always, in principle, be recovered. Tulving rebutted this, stating that it's entirely plausible that a particular retrieval environment or combination of cues necessary for recovery might simply never be reinstated or recreated for a variety of reasons. Maybe the right context never reappears, or the internal state is unachievable again. So permanent forgetting is still very much possible. The theory doesn't deny it. It just reframes its cause from trace degradation to permanent inaccessibility due to irretrievable cues.
Okay, so it's not saying everything's recoverable, just that if you could perfectly recreate the right conditions.
Right, then the memory might be accessible. But recreating those conditions might be impossible. Then there was the infinitely regressive series argument, which sounds like a logical trap. Critics suggested that if forgetting is due to forgotten cues, well, those cues must have their own forgotten cues, and so on, ad infinitum. Tulving's elegant counter-argument uses a simple analogy. Reading becomes impossible when the light is turned off, as remembering is impossible when relevant retrieval information is lacking. No one would claim that the absence of light is itself a consequence of the failure of perception. Cues are part of the retrieval environment, external or internal. They are not memories to be forgotten themselves. That breaks the infinite regress. The cues are the conditions for retrieval, not items to be retrieved.
Ah, that's clever. The light isn't forgotten, it's just off.
Exactly. A more serious criticism, which Tulving candidly conceded, was the non-refutable criticism. As a very general principle, cue-dependent forgetting can be hard to directly refute in its broadest sense because it's difficult to prove a negative to definitively say a memory is not accessible with any possible cue, ever. However, Tulving argued that despite this, it serves as an incredibly useful general principle. It profoundly guides theoretical thinking and inspires the development of testable, specific theories about memory processes. It's a guiding light, maybe a heuristic, even if it's not a complete, self-contained, and perfectly falsifiable theory in every single detail. And it has certainly proven its worth by generating so much fruitful research over the decades.
So it's a powerful and enduring framework that continues to guide how we understand one of those fundamental human experiences. It offers both profound practical insights and countless avenues for deeper scientific exploration. It really makes us feel like active participants in our own memory, rather than just passive recorders.
Yeah.
Hashtag, tag, tag, outro. Wow, okay, what an incredible journey into the world of memory and forgetting. What truly stands out to me most is how much potential control we might actually have over our own memories, simply by understanding the profound power of cues. It really shifts the entire narrative, doesn't it? From my memory is failing or I'm losing my mind to something more like, okay, I just need to find the right key to access what's already there. That's incredibly empowering, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, the most significant and empowering key insight from this deep dive is that for a vast number of instances, most forgetting is not about permanent loss. It's about temporary inaccessibility. This deep dive has fundamentally shown us that memory is not a passive storage system, just recording and playing back information like a video recorder. No, instead, it's an active, dynamic, and highly reconstructive process. It's deeply intertwined with our retrieval environment, both internal, like our emotional state and physiological conditions, and external, like our physical surroundings and social context. From the words we learn to the complex experiences we have, even to the very effects of aging on our recall, the presence or absence of effective cues often dictates not just what we can remember, but how easily and how richly we can access those past experiences.
So what does this all mean for you, our curious listener, as you navigate your daily life? Well, next time you feel that frustrating tip-of-the-tongue moment, or you can't recall something you know, don't just despair that it's gone forever. Instead, maybe take a conscious moment to consider what kind of cue might unlock it. Think about the context you were in when you first learned or experienced it, the sights, sounds, smells. Consider your emotional or physical state at that time. Reflect on any related meanings, categories, or associations. You might be genuinely surprised by what you can recover just by consciously searching for the right trigger. It's really a testament to the resilience of your own mind.
And for that final provocative thought to leave you with, if our memories are so heavily dependent on the specific cues available to us, both internal and external, does this imply that our personal narrative, the very story of our lives that shapes our identity, is less about a fixed, immutable record that we simply retrieve, and maybe more about a constantly reconstructed tapestry, one that's woven and rewoven by the specific cues we happen to encounter or generate in the present moment. And if so, what responsibility do we have to consciously curate those cues, both internally and externally, to shape not just what we remember, but the very stories we can tell about ourselves and our past?
Food for thought indeed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We truly hope this extensive exploration of cue-dependent forgetting has given you a fresh, maybe more empowered perspective on your own mind and its incredible, intricate workings. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.